Hello again and welcome to the 7th video in the series on Cybis porcelains. Trademarks and signatures have been used in the ceramic decorative arts industry dating back to the earliest firms in both America and Europe. These marks are not only instrumental in identifying the maker of an item, but also establish the prestige associated with a piece created and sold by a reputable firm or studio. The Cybis studio followed this precedent in making the magnificent works of art they released. The Cybis signatures and hallmarks assured buyers they owned a genuine sculpture produced by the finest porcelain art studio to ever exist in the United States of America. From the first sculptures produced by Boleslaw and Marja Cybis, pieces were marked with various signatures, initials, logos, and hallmarks. This is an important part of the studio's history and establishes a process for collectors to determine a legitimate age for older porcelain sculptures. As the Cybises established their studio and began production, the markings they chose would change over the years, reflecting both challenges and opportunities. The many designs of their marks and subtle changes of the signatures the studio used not only identify a Cybis sculpture as authentic, but can be used in establishing the age on most pieces. The studio acknowledged few records were kept in the beginning. However, as collectors sought older Cybis works, values of those pieces increased. The need to easily identify items on the secondary market as having been produced by Cybis prompted the release of a partial list of signatures and marks used. The 1978 and 1979 catalog both provided a list of published marks and signatures used during approximate dates throughout the studio's history. While this list is of immense importance to anyone researching older items, it is not complete and many discrepancies have been found that deserve explanation. If the only goal is to identify a sculpture as having been produced by Cybis, any signature or mark from this list is valid in determining authenticity. If the age of a sculpture is in question, the dates shown in the list should be considered as approximate. This list was compiled and published 25 years after the official formation of the studio in 1953. With Boleslaw's death in 1957, Marja's death in 1958, and the untimely passing of Marilyn Charlton in 1977, few were left from the early days that had knowledge of when the various marks were used. It should be kept in mind the list was meant to be a basic guide to assist collectors and not a definitive compilation. Note the catalog specifically lists the marks as signatures and hallmarks. They did not state they were trademarks. For clarification, a trademark is a recognizable insignia, word, or symbol that denotes a specific product and legally differentiates it from all other products of its kind. Cybis did not actually begin registering any of the studio's designs for copyrights until the mid-1960s. As signatures were used from the beginning to identify Cybis products, hallmarks can also be found on the earliest pieces. A hallmark refers to an official mark, series of marks, or distinguishing characteristic. While the studio would adopt the phoenix as a raised hallmark in later years, the earliest pieces often had a hallmark in the form of the studio's design number written on the bottom. While this practice may have been implemented for internal purposes, the fact the number was applied to a product made it a hallmark in technical terms. The design or model number is a distinguishing characteristic that can be used in identifying a Cybis product when no other mark is found. While the studio has published the statement that all Cybis items were marked, conflicting evidence would seem to suggest this was not correct. However, it is known that some items were marked using adhesive stickers which may have been intentionally removed or simply fell off over time. It has also been observed that some stamps and painted signatures on glazed and even bisque surfaces will come off when various cleaning products are used. A future video will address ways to clean Cybis porcelain safely without running the risk of damaging the sculpture or harming any marks or signatures. In reviewing the 1978 and 1979 signature and hallmark lists, it should be noted there are omissions and misclassifications. Again, the list was compiled in some cases more than a quarter of a century after the earliest marks were used, so it's doubtful this was intentional, and we are fortunate that the list was released as an official publication of the studio. While the list does show the initials of Marja and Boleslaw Cybis arranged vertically as the first and oldest signature used, to date this signature has only been found on cold cast plaster pieces known as Popka from the early 1940s. The next known Cybis signature used was the MB Cybis signature. Usually written in blue, it is found on one-of-a-kind china and porcelain items. This signature was not included in the list at all, but many surviving examples provide evidence of this signature today. Since these first two known signatures were used prior to the official Cybis studio being formed in 1953, the items bearing these signatures, while produced by the Cybises, were not used on products released by the actual Cybis studio. To make it easier to understand what marks were used on items produced by the Cybis studio, the signature list needs to be updated. In so doing, to have a correct list of signatures used on porcelains, it's necessary to add the cursive Cybis stamp to the list, which was not included. It is unlikely that this was an oversight, since it was used for 6 to 7 years. With the major shift in style and design that occurred in the late 1950s, the studio had distanced itself from the commercial mold products in its earlier years. With those items being similar to the Corday line, this omission was likely intentional. Also, the 1978 and 79 lists show two signatures used on publications that should have been listed as signatures used on porcelains. Known pieces exist with these signatures. While it is possible these signatures were used in print on Cybis literature as well, they were regularly used as signatures on porcelain items from the periods specified. From this revised list, we now have a total of 8 marks used as signatures on porcelain items released by the Cybis studio. Of these 8 signature marks, 6 were retired over the years with 2 remaining in production from 1966 until the studio ceased regular production in the early 2000s. The first signature mark used by the studio is the 2 back-to-back Cs. Each letter C is believed to stand for Cybis, with one for Boleslaw and one for Marja. The dates provided indicate this mark was used from 1942 to 1950. These dates present another challenge. The earliest release date shown in the appendix of either of the 2 catalogs for any item is 1952. This issue is resolved when we again refer back to the studio's earlier statements that no comprehensive listing exists of all items made. That statement explains how items prior to 1952 could have the Cybis mark. Obviously, the Cybis marks were being used prior to the incorporation of the Cybis studio in 1953. The back-to-back C mark was in use between 1942 and 1950, but has been found on items produced through the mid-1950s. This is confirmed by the fact pieces exist that have dual marks. This is explained when considering how the back-to-back C mark displays on an item. All back-to-back C marks found to date have been raised marks in bas-relief. This means the mark was created on the mold used to form the piece. By engraving or etching the mark into the mold, porcelain slip fills the area where the mark was created, which then forms a raised mark on the finished sculpture. Once the mark was added to the mold, it obviously wasn't removed. Items introduced during the time period the mark was used from 1942 to 1950 continued in production for several years well after 1950. With the introduction of the next signature mark, items were still being created from the original mold with the back-to-back Cs. Once a piece was created, the current mark was applied by stamp or paint, creating a piece with dual marks. In these dual mark scenarios, the newest mark on the piece identifies the age of the actual item. An angel with a raised back-to-back C mark and a stamped Cybis mark would date from 1950 to 1956. The angel was made from the old mold containing the back-to-back C mark and then marked again with the current mark in use at the time. The back-to-back C mark has also been found with the hand-signed Cybis mark as shown here. This figure was a Holland mold sculpture acquired by the studio around 1950 or earlier. Cybis added the floral bouquet, pigtails to her hair, and her ribbon-adorned hat. The piece was done in the sepia finish used primarily in the early 1950s. The fact the signature is hand-painted means she could not have been produced prior to 1953. The second signature on our list is the all-capital block letter Cybis stamp, entered in production in 1945. The earliest use of this signature was with ink applied by a stamp. The signature is one of two that remained in use throughout the studio's history. From the 1960s forward, it's found as an incised mark stamped into the porcelain prior to firing. Often, but not always, these incised signatures are also found with the year of design. Other instances are found where it is accompanied by the copyright symbol as well. The third signature introduced in 1947, which is technically a hallmark, is the incised encircled eagle. Of all of the Cybis signatures, this is perhaps the most rarely found. On some sculptures, it has been observed with one of the other signatures creating a dual mark, but since it has been found alone as the sole identifying mark on a sculpture, with no other signatures present, Cybis classified it as a signature even though it was an image with no text. While the catalog states it was used during the years of 1947 to 1951, to date it has only been found on religious pieces from the early 1950s. These pieces were released as Cybis items while Corday was still in production in the same building. It's possible the mark was designed and used because it was radically different from any mark Corday had used. It has only been found as an incised mark. No versions of the third signature mark have been seen to date where it was applied by a stamp with colored ink. After some consideration, it may have been decided the mark was too nondescript for use as an identifier of Cybis products and was retired in favor of signatures using the Cybis name. Like the first signature, this mark was applied to molds made or purchased between 1947 and 1951. The encircled eagle would have been added as a raised image to the mold, so it would display as an incised mark on an actual piece. The mark was retired in 1951 and not actively used again after this date, even though the molds with the mark were still in use, creating the visible image. The studio was no longer actively applying the mark to new designs, but for those sculptures remaining in production that were designed between 47 and 51, the mark would still be present on any item made. The fourth signature was omitted from the 1978 and 79 lists. This signature is actually the most widely found mark on early 1950s products from the studio. This stamp was introduced at the time Cybis was being produced in tandem with Corday at the Church Street location. A similar stamp was being used on Corday items and was likely made by the same company that produced the Cybis stamp. The cursive Cybis signature was applied by a rubber stamp using colored ink. The colors seen most frequently are black, blue, red, pink, and brown. It is not uncommon to find a signature of mixed color, which was likely due to the stamp not being cleaned before hitting the stamp pad of a different color. Obviously, no quality control measures were in place to prevent this from happening, and it probably was not considered to be of any concern in the marking process. Every Cybis item produced in the first half of the 1950s can be found with the cursive Cybis signature. The fifth signature, based on what appears to be a handwritten signature of the name Cybis, was a custom-made stamp placed in production from 1950 to 1960. This stamp has so far been found in black and red, but other colors would not be unlikely. Overlapping the fourth signature, it's not known why two different signatures were being used or if there is any significance to this oddity. If more sculptures are found with the two signatures, perhaps an identifiable pattern may be recognized that could answer this question. So far, no examples have been found where both were used together as a dual mark on one piece, nor has an item been found where multiple copies of a specific sculpture have been found with either signature. If multiple copies of the same sculpture turned up, some having signature number 4 and others with signature number 5, This would indicate there was no specific purpose between the two since they were both introduced around the same time. Signature number 6 is the third stamp with only the name Cybis, but in a bit more modern cursive script. In comparing the three stamped signatures, it would be a logical assumption that perhaps the signature stamp design had evolved over the years with fresh updates periodically, but this fails on the fact that the fourth and fifth signatures were used in tandem throughout the 1950s. The studio indicates the sixth signature was used from 1952 through 1966, but to date, pieces have only surfaced with the sixth signature from the late 50s through the early 60s. An anomaly relating to how pieces were marked from the early 1950s to the early 1960s is the periodic use of adhesive stickers. The use of stickers in place of a stamped or painted signature was intermittent. Stickers have been found on items where a piece could otherwise not be easily signed. In a few instances, pieces have been found where the standard Cybis signature was applied and a sticker was also attached. Other pieces have been found with no identifying mark or signature, but residue is present, indicating a sticker of some sort had been attached. The residue could have come from a merchant's price tag or any other imaginable scenario where a sticker had been applied. But in all likelihood, if no other identifying mark is found, originally the piece most likely had a sticker attached with a Cybis signature to mark the piece. The stickers found to date display the fourth and sixth signatures, usually in pink or red. They were not professionally printed, but rather done in-house. The blank sticker was applied and the Cybis signature was then stamped on the sticker. Some stickers have the design number written under the Cybis signature. Unfortunately, most stickers lost their adhesiveness over time and fell off, came off during cleaning, or were removed by owners who saw no value to leaving the sticker intact. These unmarked pieces present a challenge to anyone attempting to either identify a sculpture or to determine its age. However, unmarked pieces are often found with a 3 or 4-digit model number referred to by the studio as a design number. This number most often was written on the bottom, but has been found written in other areas near the signature when not signed on the underside of the piece. These numbers can be used to identify unknown items. As stated earlier, these design numbers applied by the studio are technically hallmarks that identify the Cybis product. The appendix in the back of both the 1978 and 1979 catalogs list sculptures alphabetically and include design numbers. These lists are not complete, so most older items are not included. The good news here is countless hours have been invested in creating online resources which are continuously updated, adding older pieces when discovered. The seventh signature used is also rarely seen. Used from 1953 until Boleslaw's death in 1957, the stamp of his signature in brown is believed to have been reserved for porcelains he personally worked on or had designed. In this example, a quail, with highly detailed painting in the sepia stained glass finish, sits surrounded by various plants and grasses. The underside is marked with several hallmarks. At the top, we see the seventh signature stamp. Below that is the design number 954, a hallmark written in pencil. To the right is the sepia hallmark, the studio's own term for the unique brown-toned color scheme used to decorate this sculpture. Finally, in the raised square box is the incised hand-signed Cybis signature, which is the eighth signature. This piece is dual marked and has two hallmarks. Oddly enough, I'm fortunate enough to have two pieces like this in my collection. From the same era, a St. Francis contains both the design number, 2085, and sepia hallmark. It is dual marked with the fourth and eighth signatures. The eighth signature is again incised into the porcelain. This indicates it's possible sepia pieces made during this time were all signed with several identifying marks. These two examples with dual marks again illustrate the overlap between signatures. Both of these items contain the earliest examples of the eighth signature, the hand-signed Cybis mark, which was the second of the two marks used until the studio ended production. The eighth signature can be found in a wide variety of colors. Whether incised, written, or painted, the pattern follows a cursive format with the capital C leading into the Y, which breaks with the B. The last three letters, BIS, are most always joined in the cursive style. This mark became the standard signature used and will always be found on items produced by the studio after 1965. If a sculpture produced after this date is missing the signature, it was either intentionally removed or came off during cleaning by the owner. These examples from the early 1950s have the same incised signature shown on the quail in St. Francis. Oddly enough, the woodland bear scene is in the sepia tonations but does not have the sepia or design number hallmarks. This piece had been cleaned prior to my acquiring it. If the sepia or design number hallmarks were previously present, those marks were likely removed. Other marks worth mentioning are mold marks the studio often overlooked. Having purchased several commercial molds from the Holland Mold, Atlantic Mold, and Ludwig Schmidt mold companies, Cybis failed to remove some of the trademarks these companies placed in the molds they produced. The studio did remove many of these marks before putting the molds into production. However, several designs were produced from molds where the mold maker's hallmark was not removed and can be seen on Cybis products. In this case, a Madonna from Holland Mold, Cybis design number 245, contains the incised mark Holland Mold in all capital letters. The mark is not obvious at first, but when tilting the piece back and forth in bright light, the shadowy incised mark is revealed. Another example is seen on the cherub wall plaques with design number 233 and 234. This is an example of an unsigned set. These two possibly had stickers originally identifying them as Cybis that later came off. What did not come off was the 233 design number, now barely visible, and the copyright LS initials for Ludwig Schmidt. One other unusual example of a Cybis signature is the raised hallmark on a Holland Mold Angel design number 2001. This signature was clearly done by hand and not in the typical Cybis style. This piece dates to the mid-1950s. Throughout the 1960s, the copyright insignia frequently accompanied the signature and periodically included the year mark as well. Additions to the signature in later years, such as Made in the USA, Cybis USA, and Trenton, New Jersey, are found hand-painted and common after the mid-1980s. The raised bas-relief hallmark of the phoenix became the Cybis hallmark appearing on most Cybis sculptures. Introduced about 1974, it was used widely on most sculptures and printed material. Even though an earlier phoenix had been introduced in the early 1960s, it was only used on publications and for marketing. To date, it has not been found on any porcelain sculpture. The 1974 phoenix was redesigned in 1979, making its debut on the cover of the 1979 catalog, and then began appearing in porcelain on the 1980 introductions. Strangely, by the late 1980s, the 1974 Phoenix rose from the ashes to new life, and both versions were being used in regular production. In a few instances, the Phoenix appears also as a painted image, as seen here on the hem of the gown worn by the Queen of Sheba. Fittingly so, the final hallmark used in regular production of the studio was the 50th anniversary back stamp applied to pieces introduced in 1989 and for that year only. After 1989, the studio seems to have quit maintaining any form of consistency in how pieces were marked. Interesting markings can be found on some later sculptures from the 1980s where the artist decorating the piece wrote the color palette numbers used to paint the piece on the bottom. There is no explanation as to why this was done during the later 1980s. It had not been done previously, and it is not found on older pieces. It could only be explained as a possible internal change to accommodate training new decorators. The last mark worthy of acknowledgement is that of AP, which stands for Artist's Proof. An artist's proof is one of the first copies created in porcelain prior to the production of the design's standard issue. These copies were then used by the painters, also known in the Cybis studio as decorators, as a guide or pattern to follow when completing the decoration process for normal production pieces. The artist's proof is used by the decorator to ensure every subsequent sculpture produced for sale is a duplicate of the original. This guarantees each copy repeats the colors, patterns, designs, and styles intended. Even though artists' proofs were used, every piece was a handcrafted work of art, and no two pieces are exactly alike. When sculptures were retired or limited editions completed, the artist's proof copies were no longer needed. Many of these artist's proof copies were donated to museums, college libraries, and charitable auctions. Around 1974, the studio donated a sizable number of artists' proof copies to the Mercer County Community College in West Windsor, New Jersey, just east of Trenton, with the intention of creating one of, if not the largest collections of Cybis in the United States. The college retains the collection in storage as part of its permanent art holdings. It is not currently on display for public viewing at this time. When the studio opened its own gallery with direct sales to customers, several of these artist-proof copies were sold to the public. With the liquidation of the remaining studio archives and backstock, items consistently turn up on the secondary market today with the AP mark. The signatures and marks shown in this video are not a comprehensive collection of every signature or mark used. The examples presented were taken from my personal collection and are a good representation of what is generally found on porcelains released by the Cybis studio. There is always the possibility an unusual or out-of-character mark or signature exists and hopefully will come to light so everyone can learn better how to identify and date the most prestigious and spectacular porcelain sculptures ever produced in the United States. To explore and learn more about Cybis porcelains and the history of the studio in Trenton, visit the Cybis archive on the internet at cybisarchive.com. The archive provides researchers with in-depth information on each piece having been found to date, as well as historical details about the studio. I hope you have enjoyed this information that we have discussed on signatures and hallmarks found on Cybis porcelains, and I invite you to watch the other videos in this series. If you like the content in this episode, please subscribe to this channel so you can receive notifications as future videos are released. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the future about Cybis, porcelains that fire the imagination.